Okay, hi, good afternoon everyone. My name's Ella Smiley and I work at the Committees of Advertising Practice, and today I'm going to talk about the work that the ASA and CAP have been doing on gender stereotyping in ads, which has led to a new rule that's going to come into force in June, on June the 14th this year. I'm also going to talk about the guidance that underpins that rule, and that guidance also illustrates the kinds of treatment that are likely to be a problem under the new rule. But first of all, I thought it would be helpful to go into a bit of background about why the rule was introduced in the first place. So we initiated a piece of ASA work in 2016, which was as a result of our intelligence gathering work, which told us that social norms and expectations were changing around gender equality, as was legislation and corporate policy. We knew that advertising was becoming a part of that narrative around pervasive gender inequality, and we wanted to take a bold approach to ask ourselves whether we were in the right place in our regulation of gender stereotypes in advertising. So that project led us to publish a comprehensive report in July 2017, and that full report that you can see on the slide is freely available on the ASA website, including the public opinion research, which gives some interesting consumer insight. So do go and have a look if you haven't read that already. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we did to put that report together and what we learned from that information. So the approach that we took with the report was to collate all of the evidence on gender stereotypes. So we started off casting the net very wide, and then we narrowed our focus onto how the issues are relevant to advertising regulations specifically. We looked at our own database to see what kinds of complaints we received about the depiction of men and women. We looked at the legal and social context to set the scene. So what does the UK law say about gender equality, and what would the social and economic benefits be to challenging real world inequalities, things like the gender pay gap? We looked at other ad regulators' approaches around the world to looking at gender stereotypes and noted that it's an area that's already successfully managed by some of the countries. We also looked at some of the industry initiatives that are already underway within the UK advertising industry to increase equality and diversity in advertising. And in terms of our own research, we did three things. We did a call for evidence to academics and lots of our own desk research to find existing papers and studies about the effect of gender stereotypes in general, and specifically in relation to advertising. We held stakeholder seminars to find out more about experts' views of gender stereotypes in ads. And we tried to include people with diverse perspectives, including those who might want to advocate for the status quo, as well as those who might want change, because we wanted to make sure within those seminars that we didn't just have rooms of people agreeing with each other. And finally, we commissioned our own public opinion research, and this included consumers from all nations and regions of the UK, from different ages, from 3 upwards, and from different demographic groups. And we collated evidence from all of those different sources in order to ask ourselves this question of whether we were in the right place in our regulation of gender stereotypes in ads. And what that report told us was that there are lots of real-world harms and inequalities in our society. And the kinds of real-world inequalities we identified were things like a lack of women in science and engineering careers, a lack of women in leadership roles, a lack of men in caring and teaching careers, a crisis in male mental health, and violence against women and girls. And while gender stereotypes aren't entirely responsible for the existence of those inequalities, they can play a role in reinforcing them. So essentially what the evidence told us is that individuals in society are being held back by outdated views of what men and women can do and how they should look and behave, and these perceptions can be reinforced by gender stereotypes. So the harm that this can lead to is well evidenced, and it can be financial, physical, or emotional. Of course, we know that advertising plays a role in influencing people, that's why we do it. But we also know that there are lots of other things that influence people's outlook, not just advertising. So we know that ad regulation isn't going to end all of these gender inequalities or these kinds of harms, but it is important that advertising regulation plays a role and stays in step with social change. We heard a couple of general points from our research, that ads may often mirror society, but if in doing so they're mirroring an unequal society, that shouldn't be used to defend or justify harmful representations. And free speech was a theme too. Obviously, we're used to balancing human rights with commercial freedoms, but some stakeholders wanted to be absolutely certain we could get that balance right on a sensitive issue like this one. And ultimately, the report concluded that while the existing ASA position is broadly already in the right place on the kinds of gender stereotypes that objectify or sexualize or depict an unhealthily thin body image, the report told us that we needed to do more to tackle some depictions of gender stereotypical roles and characteristics, and those that mock people for not conforming. So the evidence doesn't tell us that all gender stereotypes are harmful, but it has helped us to identify the kinds of depictions that have that potential to cause harm or serious or widespread offence. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the ASA's existing position in some of these areas. And as I say, the ASA already has quite a strong position in upholding complaints that about ads that objectify, sexualise or promote unhealthily thin body image. And this position has been developed quite organically over a number of years to reflect social expectations, and they're currently considered under general rules on offence or social responsibility, but in the future might be considered under the new rule on gender stereotypes as well, or instead of those general rules. So here we have an example of an ad that's already been banned by the ASA. Here you can see that the model is very thin and her head looks disproportionately large in relation to her body, and her skin is pale while she has dark circles around her eyes. So complaints about this ad were upheld. Complaints about ads featuring very thin models have in general been upheld where the image suggests that being unhealthily thin is somehow glamorous or desirable. But just to be clear, using thin models isn't always automatically a problem. Generally, the ASA won't uphold complaints where the model is thin but still appears healthy. And the ASA report confirmed that generally the position on these kinds of ads was in the right place. And it's a similar story for ads that include images that objectify or sexualize. We've got some examples on the slide here. So when we talk about objectification and sexualization, they both broadly relate to how people's bodies and sexuality are displayed in advertising. They're obviously closely connected categories that overlap, but they are separate. So the way we define objectification in our report is the depiction of an individual in a way that focuses on their body, whether or not in an overtly sexual manner, and reduces them to a physical object. So for example, obscuring a model's face and focusing on other body parts is an example of objectification. Sexualization can be defined separately in that it refers more generally to the portrayal of ads of individuals in a sexual manner. And so here we've got some examples of ads that have been banned by the ASA for objectifying or sexualizing men and women. Generally, the ASA will consider nudity inappropriate if it's not related to the product. So for example, with the Tunnux ad that you can see up there, clearly the product is unrelated to the image of the woman's leg and buttocks. And the estate agent one we've got here is interesting because it depicts a man. We don't usually see this kind of depiction. It tends to be women that are objectified more in ads, but it does happen, and when it does, the ASA will take a very similar approach. And the underwear one is interesting because usually the ASA will be more lenient about nudity if an ad is for underwear or swimwear, because obviously you want to show the product. But in this example, there's a more sexualized pose and quite sexualized language, and that combined with the fact that you can't actually see her face meant that that one was banned by the ASA under general rules. So as well as reinforcing the ASA's position on these kinds of ads, the report also helped us to understand how gender stereotypical roles and characteristics can also harm or offend. So gender stereotypical roles would be occupations or positions within the family or within society that are usually associated with men or women. So for example, portraying women in a domestic role or a childcare role, and depicting men doing DIY or construction work would be a gender stereotypical role. Whereas characteristics are attributes or behaviours that tend to be associated with a particular gender. So for example, women might be stereotypically depicted as being passive or emotional, while men might be shown as being aggressive or dominant or incapable of expressing emotion. So in our report, we found that repeatedly depicting women in ads as being submissive, enticing, or always in caring and low status roles can have an effect on their achievements and their aspirations and their self-esteem and the way that they're perceived by society as a whole. So I've got some examples up here. Just to note, I've got some examples here, and on the next few slides, these were some examples of ads that were considered in our report. Obviously, they haven't been considered by the ASA under the new rule, as that hasn't come into force yet. So I'm not saying that these ads that I'm showing you now are definitely unacceptable under the new rule, but they're just examples of the kinds of elements and key findings from the report that are of interest. So here you can see some depictions of ads featuring families, and we found that family portrayals in ads often don't reflect modern society, that men can typically be portrayed quite negatively as a kind of doofus dad who can't carry out simple tasks, but by contrast is often powerful and assertive outside of the home. And that really contrasts with the reality for most people who increasingly share domestic tasks within homes. We also found that gender stereotypes can discourage men from expressing or discussing their emotions, and that this can have seriously harmful implications for their mental health and their likelihood to seek help for mental health problems. And we also found that gender stereotypes can often reinforce each other. So an ad that does portray a man as being useless at domestic tasks isn't just detrimental to men, it also reinforces the stereotype that the home is the woman's domain. We also found that young men in the UK are increasingly starting to experience body image issues, and this can affect their confidence and their mental health in a similar way to how we know it already affects young women. We found that some groups might be more vulnerable than others. So, for example, ads featuring new mums were highlighted as having a potentially harmful effect if they implied that physical appearance or high standards in housework and cleaning should be a priority for that group. And we found that children can really internalise what they see in gender stereotypes as they learn about their place in the world. So some kinds of stereotypes can affect their aspirations and their self-confidence, and ultimately can inform their education and career choices. So there can be quite long-lasting effects. And we found that juxtaposing stereotypical characteristics such as boys being adventurous and active and girls being passive can further reinforce those limiting expectations. And because we know that children take their cues from lots of different places, we also learned that it's quite important to think about the way that stereotypical depictions of boys and girls can reinforce adults' perceptions, which can then affect the way they treat boys and girls differently, creating a kind of vicious circle type effect. And finally, we were reminded that gender is not the only stereotype. So people that we spoke to representing the LGBT community reminded us that depictions that mock people for not conforming to stereotype can reflect or reinforce bullying experienced by young people. And similarly, we were reminded that where gender stereotypes combine with racial stereotypes, there's a strong chance that any harmful or offensive effect can be amplified. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour of what we learnt in the ASA report. And given the conclusions in that report warranted a tougher position from the committees of advertising practice, those industry-led committees, which, just to remind you, they own and write our broadcast and non-broadcasting codes, they developed proposals for a new rule, one for the CAP code and one for the BCAP code, and consulted on that new rule and guidance last year. And that resulted in a decision to introduce the new rule, and that's going to come into effect in June, on June the 14th this year. As you can see from the slide, the rule is very simple and it's very principle-based. So it aims to prevent gender stereotypes that have the potential to harm or cause serious or widespread offence. Obviously, because it's a very simple rule, it begs the question, how will it be interpreted? And so the detailed guidance that we've also consulted on and published is going to be really important to help practitioners avoid falling foul of the new rule. So I'm going to talk you through this guidance now. As I say, it is very detailed. It's as detailed as we can make it to try and make it as helpful as possible. And it draws from all of the evidence that we've collated in the ASA report. Because the rule hasn't been introduced yet or tested by the ASA, we don't have any case studies to show you where the ASA is drawing the line in practice. But the guidance does include some examples which are as illustrative as we could make them based on the evidence that we've collated. And these scenarios were drawn up by the committees using that evidence to help practitioners see the kinds of depictions that might be problematic within an ad under the new rule. This guidance is available. The formatting on the slides isn't exactly the same as it is on the guidance itself. So if you want to look at this guidance in more detail, you can download it from our website. I'm just going to go through the introduction first. There's a few pages of introductory text to kind of set the scene and make sure the context is clear for practitioners using this guidance. And one of the first things to note is that the guidance is really clear from the outset that it's not intended to prevent ads from featuring glamorous or attractive people. It's not intended to prevent ads for products that have been developed for men or women from being targeted at or featuring that group. And I think this is important to bear in mind as a kind of headline, because we're really not talking about fundamental challenges to advertising here. It's, as you'll see from the guidance, it's all about the very kind of specific treatments and the nuance that could tip an ad into being a problem. And here again are a few other things to kind of bear in mind, just to kind of set the scene for the guidance. So first of all, the ASA is likely to consider stereotypes from the perspective of the group being stereotyped. So if you're representing a group in your ad, particularly a marginalised or underrepresented group, it might be helpful to think about any kind of research or focus group insight that you've got into that group to make sure you're not sleepwalking into an offensive or harmful stereotype, because if there are complaints, the ASA is likely to place more weight on the perspective of the people who are being represented in the ad. And on a related note, while we're clearly not banning humour from ads, it's not likely to be acceptable to depict the kinds of stereotypes that are identified in this guidance and then try and frame it as a joke. That's not a get out of jail free card. So a good rule of thumb when thinking about humour is that it's more likely to be okay if you're laughing with someone rather than at them, which again goes back to considering it from the view of the group being stereotyped. You know, would they find that joke funny? And then we've got a paragraph about other stereotypes. And as I mentioned earlier, the ASA report signposted some other stereotypes, particularly racial stereotypes, as being important to think about. So obviously, combining other stereotypes with gender stereotypes can increase the risk of harm or offence, so tread carefully. Obviously, lots of advertisers are using more diverse representations in their ads, and I'm sure we'd all encourage that. So this isn't intended to discourage you from doing that. But again, it might be helpful to think about whatever research you have on your target markets and who you're trying to speak to ensure that you're depicting people in a way that resonates with them rather than relying on tired old tropes. And here, just because the position on some kinds of stereotypes is already quite strong, as we've discussed, the guidance doesn't go into these areas of sexualisation, objectification and body image in any detail. They're already covered in guidance, including some case studies from the ASA. So that's referenced here and that's available on our website. So now, here we're moving on to the detailed practical stuff that's in the guidance. So there are 5 different sections to the guidance with subheadings. Each of those include a guiding principle on the right-hand side and then some scenarios on the left-hand side to illustrate the kinds of treatments that they're seeking to prevent. So here we've got scenarios featuring gender stereotypical roles and characteristics. And the scenarios on the left give you examples of the kinds of things that are likely to be unacceptable under the new rule. And as you can see, they're all about avoiding suggesting that the gender stereotypical roles and characteristics are always uniquely associated with one gender, or the only option available to one gender, or never carried out by another gender. So let's start with cleaning, because that's what lots of people think about when we talk about gender stereotypes in ads. Of course, it's still fine to show a woman cleaning. We're not saying you can never do that again. But where it would be a problem is if you had an ad featuring a kind of traditional nuclear family and a household where the dad and the kids were creating mess and then relaxing with their feet up, while the mum was the only person responsible for cleaning up that mess. We've got a few scenarios here. We've also got one that clarifies it's likely to be a problem to show somebody unable to carry out a simple task because of their gender. So for example, a man who can't change nappies because he's a man. And alongside that, we've kind of said that a slogan like "so easy, even a man can do it" is likely to be a problem, because again, that reinforces those rigid gender roles that we know can be limiting. They can limit people's aspirations and they can ultimately be harmful. And another, sorry, going back to the last one, another notable example on this slide is an ad which belittles a man for displaying emotional vulnerability. And again, we know from our evidence that there is a crisis in male mental health in the UK, and that reinforcing the idea that it's unmanly to talk about your emotions can be really damaging. So that would always be likely to be a problem in an ad. Here on the next subheading, we've got the headings about pressure to conform. And again, we're clear that this isn't about preventing glamorous or attractive people from appearing in ads. But where you might get into problems is if you depicted somebody who was unhappy with multiple aspects of their life and then changed their body shape to conform to a gender stereotypical, idealized body shape, and suddenly that was the thing that solved all of their problems. So the harm that we're trying to prevent here is the suggestion that conforming to a stereotypical ideal, like a narrow waist for women or a six-pack for men, is the thing that's key to an individual's well-being or happiness. And similarly, the second scenario here tells us that featuring someone who is unsuccessful romantically or socially because they don't conform, that's likely to be a problem. Here we've got a subheading about children. We know that children are very susceptible to internalising stereotypes. They are like sponges and they take all of their cues from everything around them. But we also know that ads that are targeted at children often reflect market research and insight into what children want to play with or want to do. So this section does finely balance the right of advertisers to feature a single sex group playing with a stereotypical toys. So for example, it's still fine to feature a group of girls in a pink bedroom playing with dolls. But it could be a problem if that ad then showed a boy trying to join in and being told that boys aren't allowed, or he has the door slammed in his face, or something like that. So it's very much about kind of whether it explicitly tells boys or girls that they shouldn't be playing with a particular toy or undertaking a particular activity. And the second scenario here reflects the insight from the research that explicitly labelling and contrasting stereotypical attributes can reinforce limiting and harmful perceptions. So, for example, labelling an adventurous boy next to a dainty girl, this kind of treatment is likely to be a problem under the new rules, so it's probably best to avoid it. Our research also highlighted that some groups of people are particularly vulnerable to pressure to conform, and in particular the research flagged up young people and new mums as being particularly vulnerable. So both of these groups tend to have a lot going on in their lives, and sometimes they have conflicting priorities, and we found that exerting pressure to conform to stereotypes can be harmful. So the scenarios here, so we've got if an ad tells a new mum that she should be prioritising housework over other things, that could be a problem. And similarly, an ad that encouraged young people to prioritise their appearance over everything else in order to achieve social or romantic success, that's likely to be a problem as well. And finally, last but not least, we've got a section about people who don't conform to gender stereotypes. And this tells us that it's always likely to be unacceptable to mock somebody for not conforming to stereotypes. So hopefully it's pretty obvious. It's never likely to be acceptable, even if you try and do it in a humorous way, because the potential for harm is relatively significant. So it's best to steer clear of this kind of depiction. So that's it from me in terms of the report and the evidence and the guidance that's coming into force with the rule on June the 14th. I understand we don't have any questions. If you've got any, feel free to type them in for us now, or otherwise get in touch at a later date if you've got any questions. Nope, I think that's it. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful, and please feel free to download all the information from the website and share with your colleagues. Thank you very much. Goodbye.